Evan Hale never expected that one small act of kindness would change his entire destiny. But on that cold artificial evening inside Frontier Station 12, everything shifted in a way he could never fully explain. The metal corridors hummed with distant machinery. The lights flickered in a tired rhythm, and the world outside the station hung silent and dark, a stretch of endless stars waiting like quiet eyes watching from a distance. Evan had just finished his patrol when hunger pushed him toward the supply deck, carrying the warm pack of fries he bought with his own credits, a small comfort in a place where comfort didn't come often. He walked slow, tired boots dragging along the metal floor, unaware that someone was watching him from the shadows. It began with a soft sound, almost a whimper, something fragile and frightened, something that didn't belong in a place built for war. Evan froze, his pulse tightening as he scanned the dim corner near a damaged cargo pod that had been marked for disposal. The pod's metal edges were bent. Scorch marks lined its surface, like it had survived something violent. He felt the air around him shift, a strange feeling rising inside him, as if the entire station held its breath for a moment. When he moved closer, he noticed movement inside the pod, slow, tense, trembling. He raised his hand in a calm gesture, not sure why he did, maybe instinct, maybe something deeper, something human that reached out before the mind even decided. A pair of glowing eyes stared at him through the darkness, sharp, cautious, and filled with a fear that didn't belong to a dangerous creature, but to someone who had been running too long. The eyes blinked once, slow and uncertain, and then a face emerged, delicate and unfamiliar, her skin a pale silver-blue shade, her hair long and tangled like silver threads, her ears pointed softly back, her features young yet worn from exhaustion. She looked wild enough to be dangerous, yet fragile enough to break from a single harsh breath. Evan's chest tightened as he realized she wasn't just hiding. She was surviving, clinging to the last bit of safety she could find in a universe that seemed ready to crush her. He didn't move closer, he didn't raise his weapon. He simply crouched down a few feet away, letting the quiet settle between them, letting her see that he was no threat. The warmth from the fries seeped into his hands, and for some reason he found himself lifting the food slowly toward her, offering it the way someone might offer peace. She hissed softly at first, her shoulders tense, her claws digging slightly into the metal floor, but her eyes stayed locked on the warmth rising from the food. Her breath quickened, hunger pulling her forward while fear held her back. Evan whispered gently that it was all right, that she was safe for now. The words simple, but something in them made her ears lower and her growl fade. She inched forward, each movement careful, like she expected him to change his mind at any second. When she reached him, her nose lifted slightly as she sniffed the fries, her expression shifting from suspicion to desperate longing. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing his hand for a moment, and he felt how cold she was, how weak her muscles trembled, how her entire body fought between instinct and trust. Then she took the fries one piece at a time, eating with small, sharp bites while never breaking eye contact, as if she couldn't let herself look away from the one person who had offered her kindness instead of fear. Evan watched the transformation quietly, watched her shoulders drop a little, watched her breath soften, watched the wild panic in her gaze fade into confusion. Warmth, something he didn't expect to see in someone who looked like she had been hunted for days. She finished the food and kept staring at him, her pupils widening, her head tilting as if she saw something in him she didn't see in anyone else. She shifted closer, so close he could hear her soft breathing, and out of nowhere, a low protective growl rolled from her chest, not toward him, but toward the sound of approaching soldiers behind them. Evan turned, startled, seeing two patrol officers walking down the corridor, unaware of the danger they represented to the girl. Before he could even speak, she stepped in front of him, her body tense, claws visible, her stance fierce like a cornered creature ready to defend the only thing she trusted. The soldiers stopped, confused at the sight. One reached for his weapon, but Evan raised his hand quickly, telling them to stay back, his voice steady but firm. The alien girl didn't break her stance, didn't blink, didn't breathe normally. She growled again, low and threatening, making the soldiers retreat with uneasy glances. When they left, she turned back to Evan slowly, her chest rising and falling as if she had just made a choice that could never be undone. She stepped closer, her forehead almost touching his chest, her eyes soft and sure, as if she had decided something ancient and unbreakable in that moment. Evan didn't understand what he had just triggered, didn't understand why she defended him, didn't understand why her breathing calmed only when she looked at him, but the feeling in the air was unmistakable, something rare, something powerful, something that would follow both of them far beyond this station, and deep inside the dim corridor with only the hum of the lights around them. Evan realized that sharing a simple meal had created a connection he couldn't step away from anymore. Not now, not ever. Sierra followed Evan from the moment he offered her food, as if that single act had tied an invisible thread between them, a thread she refused to let go of. He walked through the dim corridor with slow steps, feeling her presence right behind him, hearing the soft rhythm of her breath, sensing the way she watched every shadow like danger lived in all of them. Other soldiers stared at them with confusion, some with concern, some with fear, because an alien girl walking so close to a human was rare, but one who growled at anyone who stepped near him was something no one had seen before. Evan didn't understand it either. Every time he tried to speak to her softly, she tilted her head like a curious child, and every time someone else approached, she stepped forward with a low warning sound that came from deep inside her throat. It wasn't aggressive without reason. It was protective, instinctive, ancient, almost like she thought he belonged to her in some way he couldn't yet understand. As they moved through the corridors, she stayed close enough that her shoulder brushed against his arm, her movement silent and graceful, her tail flicking behind her in a slow, steady rhythm, as if keeping count of every breath he took. When they reached the small medical bay, Evan tried to guide her inside so she could be checked for injuries. Her body tensed immediately, her ears pulling back, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. She let out a soft sound, something between a hiss and a plea, as if the idea of anyone touching her terrified her. Evan crouched down gently and told her she was safe, his voice calm and low, and to his surprise she relaxed only when he placed his hand slowly near her shoulder. Not touching her, just offering presence, she leaned closer, breathing in his scent as if memorizing him all over again, and stepped into the room only because he stepped first. The medic looked nervous but professional, moving carefully as he reached for his tools. Sierra's eyes locked on him instantly, her claws slipping out with a quiet metallic sound, her entire posture ready to strike if he made a wrong move. Evan quickly raised his hand, telling the medic to give them a moment. Then he turned back to Sierra, speaking softly, telling her he needed to make sure she wasn't hurt. She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face the way someone might search for a secret answer. Then she lowered her head and allowed the medic to approach. But she never stopped watching every single motion with razor-sharp focus, ready to protect Evan even while being examined herself. The medic whispered that she had bruises, minor cuts, dehydration, signs of stress, and lack of food. She was lucky to be alive. Evan felt something heavy settle inside him at those words, something like anger mixed with sadness because she was just a girl, a scared young alien girl who had begged for survival inside a broken cargo pod. She shouldn't have had to fight this hard just to breathe another day. When the medic finished, Sierra moved instantly back to Evan's side. Pressing close to him as if anchoring herself after too much vulnerability, her hand brushed against his arm lightly, almost like a silent thank you. Then she looked up at him with eyes that felt too deep for someone so fragile. He led her out of the bay afterward, and she followed him just as closely as before. But now her steps were smoother, her breathing calmer. She kept glancing at him, studying him, memorizing him with quiet fascination. Evan brought her to the crew lounge where people often gathered after shifts. The moment he stepped inside, conversations stopped. Eyes turned toward them. Whispers rose like crackling sparks as everyone saw the silver-blue alien girl walking right beside him. With the confidence of someone who had chosen her protector, Sierra didn't react to the stares. She only reacted to the people who tried to get closer to Evan. Stepping in front of him, tail flicking sharply, eyes narrowing with warning, a young technician approached them carefully with a curious smile, asking Evan if she was lost or needed help. Before Evan could answer, Sierra let out a soft growl, low and dangerous, stepping between them like a shield. The technician backed away instantly, hands raised, shaking his head as he said he meant no harm. Evan gently touched Sierra's arm, telling her it was all right. She went quiet immediately, her eyes softening when she looked at him. It was as if his voice was the only sound that mattered, the only command she trusted, the only presence that made sense to her in this strange place. Evan found a quiet corner where they could sit. Sierra lowered herself beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, her tail curling around her legs as she rested one hand on the seat near his. She didn't speak at first, only watched him with those bright feline eyes full of silent meaning. Then slowly she whispered her first human word. Her voice soft, almost trembling, she said his name. Evan. The sound of it made something warm move in his chest, because she didn't say it like someone learning. She said it like someone claiming something important. She touched her chest lightly, then touched his arm, then repeated his name again, this time with more certainty, more affection, more belonging. He realized then that she wasn't just following him. She had chosen him completely, with a devotion he didn't know how to handle yet. She watched everyone who passed, her gaze sharp and protective. Every small noise made her ears twitch. Every step near them made her muscles tighten. She was constantly alert, constantly aware, constantly ready to defend him, even though he was the soldier and she was the one who needed safety. Evan didn't know what this bond meant in her culture, didn't know what rules he had stepped into, didn't know how deep it went, but he could feel the weight of it in every breath she took beside him. And as she leaned gently against him, her eyes slowly closing as exhaustion pulled at her, Evan sensed something rising in the air between them. Something powerful, something ancient, something that would only grow stronger with time. And he knew this was only the beginning of a connection he could no longer step away from. Not after the way she looked at him. Not after the way she protected him. Not after the way she whispered his name like he was the only safe place she had left in the whole galaxy. Sierra didn't speak much, but the silence around her was never empty. It carried weight, history, and something darker that Evan couldn't name yet. Every time he looked into her eyes, he felt there were storms hidden inside them. Storms made of memories she wasn't ready to share. But one night, after everyone else on the station had gone quiet and the corridors hummed with the soft rhythm of machines resting, she finally opened a piece of her past to him, and the truth of it settled into the air like cold smoke. They sat in the observation deck surrounded by the wide black canvas of space, stars shimmering like distant wounds. Evan sat with his elbows resting on his knees while Sierra sat beside him with her knees pulled to her chest, her tail wrapped loosely around her ankles. She watched the stars with a strange longing, as if she knew each one by name, as if she had once lived among them before everything went wrong. The soft glow from the windows brushed against her silver-blue skin, making her look almost unreal. Fragile yet fierce, both broken and unbreakable at the same time. Evan waited quietly, sensing she had something she needed to say. He didn't push, didn't rush her. He simply watched her breathe, slow and careful, until she turned her head toward him, her eyes reflecting the stars outside like tiny galaxies trapped inside her gaze. She whispered his name, her voice barely a breath, and when he answered with a gentle hum, she lifted her hand and traced the shape of a star on the window, her finger trembling slightly. Then she whispered a single word, a word that felt heavy with meaning: home. He asked her softly where her home was, what had happened to her. She hesitated, her eyes flicking away, her shoulders curling inward, as if the memories clawed at her from the inside. She whispered that her people were called the Rivani, a wandering species known for their heightened senses, their intense loyalty, their fierce instinct for survival. They lived in close-knit clans, hunting together, protecting each other, bonding deeply and for life with the ones who fed them during moments of weakness. Evan felt his breath catch at that, because he suddenly understood that feeding her that day had been more than kindness. It had been something sacred in her culture. Something binding, something irreversible. Sierra drew another symbol on the glass, a curved mark that looked like a moon split in half. She told him it was the emblem of her clan, her voice growing shakier as she spoke. Then the calm in her breath shattered as she whispered about the day her world was torn apart. She spoke of metal ships appearing in the sky, ships that didn't send warnings or demands, ships that came with weapons and chains. She described the hunters, tall armored beings who captured Rivani for experiments, for studying their senses, their loyalty, their strange biological responses to emotion and fear. Her voice broke when she described how they took her mother first, her brother second, her clan scattering in panic through burning forests and cracked stone paths. She told Evan she had run for days, hunted like prey, surviving on scraps, hiding in ruined ships and abandoned outposts, until she found the damaged cargo pod drifting in a debris field. She crawled inside because it was the only place left that felt like a cage she chose instead of a cage forced upon her. She drifted for weeks, barely eating, barely breathing, waiting for death to claim her before the hunters did. But instead she woke up here on this human station, face to face with a young soldier holding a warm pack of fries and eyes that didn't look at her with fear or cruelty, but with concern. Sierra wrapped her arms around her legs tightly, her voice trembling as she whispered that she didn't trust humans when she first saw him. She didn't trust anyone anymore. But when he offered her food without expecting anything, something inside her broke, something inside her healed. Something inside her recognized him as someone who saw her as more than an experiment or a creature, She admitted that the moment he fed her, she felt a warmth she had forgotten existed, a warmth she had only ever felt with her clan, with the ones who protected her when she was young. She whispered that in her culture, food given freely during vulnerability forms a heart bond, the strongest bond a Rivani can make, a bond that says you are mine and I am yours without words, without ceremony, without choice. Evan felt his chest tighten, the air thick with emotion as her words sank deeper. He looked at her and saw not just an alien girl who followed him, but someone who had lost her entire world and anchored herself to him because he had given her the first light she had seen in months. She turned to him with tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. Shimmering like tiny stars ready to fall, she whispered that she would protect him with her life, that she would stand between him and danger no matter the cost. Because he fed her when she had nothing left to give. Because he chose her during a moment she expected to die alone in the dark. Evan reached out slowly, unsure if touching her was allowed in her culture. But Sierra leaned into his hand the moment his fingers brushed her cheek, closing her eyes as if the small gesture meant everything she had been missing. She whispered softly that she was afraid, not of him, but of the ones who hunted her. Because they would come, they always came. And now they would come for him too, because she had bonded with him, because he had taken in the one thing they wanted back. The stars outside shimmered quietly as Evan pulled her closer and told her he wouldn't let anyone take her again. And as she rested her head against his shoulder with a trembling breath, the air around them shifted, heavy with the promise of danger, heavy with the promise of a fight neither of them could escape anymore. Because the hunters were already searching, already moving, already coming closer with every ticking moment. And Sierra knew that the next time they arrived, they wouldn't be leaving without blood, either hers or Evan's or both. Alarms on Frontier Station 12 were usually calm background noise, distant reminders that the universe outside was full of storms waiting to break. But the alarms that echoed through the metal corridors tonight were different. They carried sharp tension, a rising pulse of danger, a warning that something dark was approaching from the edges of space. Evan felt the shift in the air before he heard the sound, a kind of pressure settling over the station like unseen eyes staring straight through the walls. Sierra felt it too, her ears snapping upward, her pupils narrowing to sharp slits, her body tensing like a predator sensing a rival in the shadows. She stood beside him in the dim hallway, her breathing quick, her claws out just enough to catch the fading light. Every part of her was alert, aware, listening to something he couldn't hear. She whispered a single word under her breath, a word filled with fear and certainty. Hunters? Evan's chest tightened as he stepped closer to her, asking how she knew, but she didn't need to explain. Because the trembling in her hands, the flick in her tail, the way her eyes kept scanning the ceiling like the threat was crawling straight above them, all of it told him the truth. Command summoned Evan to the briefing deck, the corridors buzzing with tension as officers hurried past with clipped voices and worried faces. Sierra stayed glued to his side, refusing to take even one step behind him. When they entered the briefing room, every conversation stopped. Officers stared at Sierra with a mixture of fear and suspicion. Her presence had been strange before, but now, with the alarms blaring and enemy signals detected near the station borders, she seemed like a puzzle piece that didn't belong, but held the answer. No one wanted to hear. The commander pointed at the incoming transmissions. Distorted signals circling the station like vultures. Patterns that didn't match any known faction. Patterns that matched only one thing in their archives. Unidentified Raider-class ships used for abductions, biological captures, and experimental trafficking. Evan felt his heart drop as Sierra whispered that it was the same frequency the hunters used when they tracked her clan. The same sound she had heard on the night her home was taken. The same looping signal that always came before her people disappeared into metal cages. The commander questioned her sharply, asking if she was sure, asking what the attackers wanted, asking why they were here. Sierra stepped slightly in front of Evan before she answered, her voice low but steady. She said they were coming for her, and they would burn through anyone standing in their way. The room filled with uneasy silence, officers exchanging tense looks, because they all knew the hunters wouldn't risk approaching a human station just to retrieve one alien girl, unless she was far more valuable than anyone realized. Evan argued that they had to protect her, that she was under his watch, but an officer stepped forward and suggested handing her over to avoid conflict. Sierra reacted instantly, a deep growl rumbling through the room as she positioned herself between Evan and the officer. Her claws fully extended now, her tail thrashing with warning. Evan grabbed her arm, gently calming her, then turned back to the officers with fire in his voice, saying she wasn't cargo, wasn't a bargaining piece, wasn't something they could trade for safety. She was under his protection, and he would not allow her to be taken again. The commander hesitated, torn between protocol and humanity, but before they could argue more, the lights flickered, the entire station trembling as something massive disturbed the outer hull. Sierra's breath caught, her eyes wide with terror. She whispered that the hunters had found the station, and they were testing the defenses just like they did with every place they planned to breach. Evan felt a cold wave run down his spine as the commander ordered a lockdown. But deep inside, he knew the lockdown wouldn't stop what was coming, because Sierra wasn't running anymore, and her enemies weren't leaving until they got her back. He took her to a secure corridor, but she grabbed his arm tightly, shaking her head, pulling him closer as she whispered that the hunters would track her scent, her energy, her heartbeat. They had hunted her species for years, and they knew every trick, every escape method, every weakness. She whispered that she didn't want him to get hurt because of her voice trembling like she was fighting tears. Evan placed his hands gently on her shoulders, telling her she wasn't alone now, telling her he wouldn't abandon her, telling her that whatever came next they would face together. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed like a scream through the walls. The station shuddered again as an external lock was forced open by something powerful. Warning sirens rose. Voices crackled over speakers ordering all soldiers to battle stations. Sierra pressed her forehead to Evan's chest, her breath hitched with fear and anger. She whispered that the hunters didn't just want her, they wanted to study him too now because she had bonded with him, because he had changed her instincts, changed her biology, changed her fate, and they wanted that connection for themselves. Evan pulled her behind him as shadows moved down the corridor. Boots pounding, soldiers preparing, officers shouting orders. But beneath all the noise he could feel something else, a silent promise that danger wasn't approaching anymore, danger was already here. Sierra held his arm tightly as her eyes glowed brighter, her body shifting with primal tension. She said the hunters always started with probes, then with shock troops, then with something worse. The station lights flickered again, and for a moment everything went quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes before a storm breaks everything in its path. And in that heavy silence, Sierra whispered a final warning that sent a shiver through Evan's bones. She said they weren't just coming for her this time, they were coming for him too. Because when he fed her that day in the shadows, he didn't just save her life, he became part of her destiny, and the hunters would stop at nothing to tear that bond apart, even if it meant tearing the entire station down around them. The first explosion shook the station like a giant hand had grabbed the metal shell and twisted it with violent force. Alarms screamed through the corridors. Red lights washed over the walls, and the entire atmosphere shifted from tension to full war in a single breath. Evan grabbed Sierra's hand and pulled her behind a reinforced barrier, as ceiling panels rattled above them. She crouched low, her muscles coiled, her eyes glowing brighter than he had ever seen. She whispered that the hunters were breaking through the outer levels, that they had come in numbers far greater than anyone expected. And her voice trembled because she knew exactly what that meant. Soldiers rushed past them, shouting orders, raising rifles, securing positions, but even in all the chaos, Sierra stayed pressed close to Evan, ready to fight for him before fighting for herself, her instincts sharpened by fear and devotion. He felt her breath against his arm, quick and uneven, like her body was preparing for something she could not avoid. He told her he would protect her, but she shook her head weakly, whispering that she was the one who had sworn to protect him, the one who would stand between him and death no matter the cost, the one who would never let them touch him. The hallway lights flickered again as the sound of heavy metal footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. A sound that did not belong to humans. A sound too deliberate, too heavy, too cold. Sierra stiffened instantly, her claws sliding out with a sharp metallic scrape, her body lowering into a defensive posture. Evan aimed his weapon, his heart pounding, knowing the hunters had finally breached the inner levels, knowing there was no more hiding, no more running, only the fight. The first hunter appeared from the smoke like a nightmare walking into the waking world, armored head to toe in dark plating, glowing blue visors shaped like jagged eyes, movements precise and terrifying. 2 more followed, then 6 more. Filling the corridor with silent menace, they moved towards Sierra. And Evan, not like soldiers advancing, but like predators reclaiming what had escaped them. Sierra growled, the sound deep and primal, vibrating through the metal floor. And even the hunters slowed for a moment as if recognizing the threat. Without warning, the hunters charged, weapons raised, firing blasts of energy that scorched the walls. Evan pulled Sierra behind him and returned fire, the blasts lighting up the corridor in violent flashes. Sierra lunged forward with unnatural speed, dodging a hunter's strike and slashing across his armor, sparks flying as her claws tore into the plating. Evan had never seen her move like this. She was a blur, a streak of silver and blue, every motion precise, every attack fueled by fear and fury. She fought not for survival but for him, for the bond that bound them. One hunter grabbed Evan from the side, slamming him against the wall, pain shooting through his ribs. Before he could recover, the creature raised its weapon to strike, but Sierra screamed, a raw, anguished sound that tore through the air, and launched herself at the hunter with such force that both bodies crashed to the floor. She clawed through the armor like it was paper, her glowing eyes wild, her breath ragged, her body radiating a faint shimmering light he had never seen before. It was her battle form, the hidden strength she warned him about, the strength she only unlocked when protecting someone she loved. More hunters pushed forward, surrounding them. Evan tried firing again, but one knocked the weapon from his hand and slammed him to the ground. The breath ripped from his lungs. Sierra saw it happen, and something inside her seemed to snap. Her entire body glowed brighter, her hair lifting as if caught in a silent wind. She released a roar that shook the corridor, a sound filled with rage and terror and loyalty so fierce it felt like the air trembled around her. She tore through two hunters before they could react, her movements almost too fast for Evan's eyes to follow. But the hunters adapted quickly, turning their weapons toward her with cold precision. One fired a shock charge that struck her side. Sending her crashing into the wall, she cried out, collapsing to her knees. Evan shouted her name and crawled toward her, ignoring the pain in his ribs, ignoring the sparks flying around them, ignoring the danger closing in. He reached her and lifted her gently, feeling her trembling, feeling her breath weakening. She looked at him with wide, terrified eyes, whispering his name like a desperate prayer. More hunters swarmed the corridor. Too many, far too many energy beams filled the air, forcing Evan to shield Sierra with his own body. She tried to push him back, tried to stand, tried to fight again, but the shock had weakened her, her limbs shaking, her claws barely holding their form. Evan clutched her tightly, refusing to let go, refusing to let them take her again. But the hunters were relentless. One stepped forward and activated a containment device, a shimmering field that wrapped around Sierra like chains of light. Lifting her slightly from Evan's arms, her scream tore through him as the hunters pulled her away. Her hand reaching out for him, her fingers trembling, her voice breaking as she begged him not to let them take her. Evan lunged forward, but three hunters held him down, their grips crushing, forcing him to watch as the containment field tightened around her, her glow fading under the suppression, her cries turning into soft broken whimpers. She called his name again, weaker, like the bond between them was being stretched to its breaking point. The hunters began retreating, dragging her with them. Evan struggled, kicked, fought, shouted her name again and again. But the hunters dragged her farther down the corridor. Her eyes locked on his until the very last second, full of fear, full of pain, full of something deeper, something that begged him not to give up, begged him to come for her, begged him to save her the way she tried to save him. And as she disappeared into the smoke and darkness, Evan felt something inside him ignite, a fire so fierce it burned away every doubt, every rule, every fear. Because he knew he would not let this be the end. He would not let them take her from him. Not after everything she had survived. Not after everything she had become to him. Not after the way she looked at him like he was her last piece of home in a universe that kept trying to take everything away from her. He would get her back no matter what it cost. No matter where the hunters ran. No matter how many battles stood between them. He would march through fire, through metal, through death itself if he had to. Because they didn't just take Sierra. They took the part of him that came alive the moment she whispered his name. Evan didn't remember making the decision to run after them. His legs moved before his mind could catch up, fueled by raw fear and anger as he pushed through smoke-filled corridors and broken metal. The station groaned around him like a wounded animal, alarms screaming in every direction, but all he could hear was Sierra's last terrified cry echoing in his skull. Every breath he took felt like fire. Every step felt like a countdown. Because he knew if he didn't reach her soon, the hunters would vanish into the void and he would never see her again. He sprinted past fallen soldiers, dodging sparks and collapsing panels, his heart pounding with a rhythm that didn't feel human anymore. It felt wild, desperate, driven by something far deeper than duty. He reached the docking bay just in time to see the hunters dragging Sierra into their ship, her body limp from the shock restraints, her eyes struggling to stay open. When she saw him, she reached out with trembling fingers, her lips forming his name without sound, and that single silent plea ripped through him harder than any wound ever could. Evan lunged forward, but a blast of energy threw him back, knocking the air from his lungs. Soldiers grabbed him, shouting for him to fall back, to let command handle it, to retreat before the hunters sealed the bay. But Evan tore free from their grip with a strength he didn't know he had, pushing through the chaos, refusing to let anyone keep him away from her. He stumbled toward the ship again, but the ramp was already closing, metal grinding against metal, sealing her away from him inch by inch. His heart felt like it was being crushed under that closing door. Sierra's eyes widened with panic as she realized she was losing him, her voice finally breaking through the suppression collar long enough for one desperate sound, a trembling cry of Evan, that echoed through the hangar like it was tearing the world apart. But the hunters shoved her back and the door slammed shut, her voice cutting off into silence. Evan slammed his fists against the metal until his knuckles bled, shouting her name, shouting for them to stop, shouting anything that could make the universe give him one more second with her. The hunter ship lifted off, engines roaring with cold fire. Soldiers screamed for everyone to take cover. But Evan didn't move. He stood there shaking, breath ragged, eyes burning, watching the ship rise into the air like a cruel hand lifting away the one thing he couldn't lose. When the engines ignited, he felt the heat rush across his skin. But he didn't care, he didn't blink, he didn't breathe. He only whispered that he would find her, his voice shaking with a promise carved out of pain. The ship blasted out of the hangar, vanishing into the star-speckled darkness beyond the force field, leaving only smoke and silence behind. Evan fell to his knees, chest heaving. Not because he was broken, but because he was changing. Something deep inside him hardening into a vow he couldn't undo. Officers ran toward him, grabbing his arms, pulling him up, demanding answers, demanding explanations, demanding protocol. But all their voices blended into meaningless noise, because his mind was already far away, already chasing after her, already planning what he had to do. He pulled himself free and stormed toward the command deck, ignoring everyone who tried to stop him, his steps heavy but steady, his heart beating with a clarity he had never felt before. He barged into the command room, the commander turning with shock and anger. But Evan didn't flinch, didn't bow, didn't hesitate. He slammed his hands on the console and demanded a shuttle, demanded access codes, demanded immediate pursuit. The commander yelled that this was suicide, that the hunters were a specialized force, that no one survived chasing them. But Evan stared him down with eyes that no longer held fear. He said he wasn't leaving without her, his voice quiet but filled with fire, the kind of fire that made even seasoned officers step back without meaning to. The commander opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, a young pilot rushed in and whispered that the hunter's ship had left a faint trail, damaged from Sierra's earlier attacks, a trail that could be tracked for a short time before it vanished into deep space. Evan seized the opportunity, telling the commander they had a chance, the only chance, and if they didn't take it now, Sierra would never return. The commander hesitated, then finally nodded, but only after Evan swore, with a voice that sounded almost like a growl, that he would take full responsibility. Evan didn't care about consequences. He cared about one thing, one life, one girl who had fought for him with everything she was. He boarded a small pursuit craft, the engines humming with restless energy. Soldiers tried to follow him, but he sealed the hatch before any of them could enter. Gripping the controls with trembling hands, the pilot's voice crackling through the comms as he transmitted coordinates, a faint ghost signal leading into the void. Evan launched the ship with a burst of acceleration that pushed him back into the seat, the stars streaking into long lines as he chased the fading trail, the station shrinking behind him until it was nothing more than a distant metal speck in a universe far too large. His breath steadied, his hands tightened, his eyes focused with cold determination, because he wasn't just chasing a kidnapped alien girl. He was chasing the part of his soul that had awakened the moment she whispered his name, chasing the bond that had grown between them stronger than blood, stronger than logic, stronger than fear. In the distance, the faint trace of the hunter's ship flickered like a wounded star waiting to be caught. Evan whispered to the empty cabin that he was coming, his voice steady now. No tremor, no panic, only certainty. He told Sierra to hold on, to fight for one more breath, one more heartbeat, one more second, because he was going to find her. No matter how far the hunters ran, no matter how many ships stood in his way, no matter what he had to sacrifice, he would bring her home, even if he had to tear the stars apart to reach her. The hunter ship drifted through the darkness like a wounded beast, its engines flickering with weakened blue light, and Evan followed that dying trail with every drop of strength he had left, his small pursuit craft shaking with the strain of pushing beyond safe limits, alarms blinking on his console. But nothing mattered except the echo of Sierra's last cry playing again and again in his mind. He whispered her name like a prayer, like a promise, like a vow carved into his bones as the distance between their ships began to shrink. The moment he caught sight of the hunter's vessel, his breath tightened, the massive black hull floating against the stars like a shadow carved from fear. Its surface cracked and scorched from earlier battles, pieces of armor missing where Sierra had fought for her life. The sight burned pain into Evan's chest, because every mark on that ship was a reminder of what she endured alone. He guided his craft closer until he reached the docking node, locked himself in place and forced the airlock open with trembling hands, stepping into the cold darkness of the enemy ship with nothing but his rifle and the fire in his heart. The corridors were dim, lit only by emergency lights that flickered like dying flames, each one casting long twisted shadows across the metal floor. The ship groaned around him like it sensed an intruder, like it knew someone had come for something it refused to surrender. Evan moved through the narrow halls, every step quiet, every breath sharp, listening for anything, voices, footsteps, machines, anything that would lead him to her. He found scorch marks on the walls, deep claw scratches, shattered panels, all signs of one desperate struggle, all signs of Sierra fighting until she had nothing left. He whispered her name again, his voice shaking not from fear but from the thought that she might not answer, that he might be too late. But then, somewhere deep in the ship, he heard a faint sound, soft, broken, like someone breathing through pain. Evan followed the sound, moving faster, turning corner after corner until he reached a reinforced door with glowing restraints pulsing along its surface. He pressed his ear against the metal and heard her heartbeat faint, her breathing uneven, her voice so fragile it barely existed. She whispered his name, not in fear this time, but in hope, as if she sensed him even through the walls. Evan forced the control panel open and rewired the lock with shaking fingers. Sparks flying, alarms flickering, warnings flashing red across the corridor. But he didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't breathe until the door hissed open with a heavy groan. Inside the room, Sierra lay strapped to a cold metal table, her wrists and ankles bound by glowing energy restraints. Her head turned weakly toward the opening, her eyes unfocused at first, then widening with trembling disbelief as she saw him standing there. She whispered his name again, this time barely a breath, but full of relief so deep it cut through him like light-breaking darkness. Evan rushed to her side, tearing at the restraints with desperate hands. His fingers burning against the energy fields, he didn't care. He kept going until each shackle snapped open with a sharp crack. The moment she was free, she collapsed forward into his arms, her body trembling violently, her breath shuddering against his chest. He held her tight, whispering that she was safe now. He was here now, he wasn't leaving her again. She clung to him with weak, shaking hands, pressing her forehead to his neck, whispering that she thought she would die without seeing him again, her voice breaking in a way that shattered him from the inside. He lifted her carefully, holding her as if she were the most fragile thing in the galaxy, though he knew she was stronger than any creature he had ever met. Her arms wrapped around him, her tail curling loosely around his leg as if trying to anchor herself to him. She whispered that she had kept fighting because she believed he would come, because she felt the bond between them, because she knew he wouldn't let her vanish into darkness. Evan pressed his forehead to hers and whispered that she was right. He would have crossed the stars barefoot if he had to. He would have fought every hunter in the galaxy if that's what it took to reach her. Footsteps thundered in the hall outside and Sierra tensed, fear shooting through her body. But Evan tightened his grip on her and stood, lifting his rifle with one hand and her with the other, ready to face whatever came. The door burst open and hunters flooded in, weapons raised. But before they could strike, Sierra's body glowed again, faint but rising, her eyes brightening with a power pulled from the edge of her strength. She whispered that the bond gave her strength too, that his presence awakened parts of her no cage could suppress. With her arm around his shoulders, she let out a low growl, and the glow around her flared like blue fire. Together they fought, Evan firing with steady precision, Sierra moving despite her injuries, striking with the last of her strength, their movements perfectly in sync, as if the bond guided their bodies like a shared heartbeat. The hunters fell one by one until the corridor fell silent, the ship groaning under the weight of its own defeat. Evan carried Sierra back toward the docking hatch, her head resting against his chest, her breathing still weak but steadier now. She whispered that she wasn't afraid anymore. Not while he held her, not while their bond still pulsed between them like a living thing. They escaped onto the pursuit craft just as the enemy ship began to collapse. Sparks bursting across its hull, flames rising like dying stars. Evan flew them away from the explosion with Sierra curled in his lap, her fingers wrapped around his jacket. Her eyes half closed as she whispered that he saved her, that he chose her, that she would spend the rest of her life guarding the heart that fed hers. Evan kissed the top of her head gently, whispering that she was safe, that she was home, that he wasn't letting her go ever again. And as the stars drifted past the small craft and the broken hunter ship burned behind them, Sierra lifted her eyes to him one more time and whispered the words that sealed their bond forever. "You fed me once, Evan, but you saved me forever."